Hi everyone, Charles from the Food People here. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. It's my great pleasure to welcome Polly and Matt from Find and Foster Cider. Polly and Matt join me to talk about why they do what they do. We're going to talk about forgotten orchards. We're going to talk about the craft and natural cider movement. We're going to talk a little bit about different types and styles of cider and how success is not always about more. Welcome, Polly and Matt.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
No
really
problem.
pleased.
Really good to have you here. At the Food People, we're very clear about why we do what we do. We're champions of change, driven every day by our intent to shift the future of food and drink by harnessing the power of trends. And in this In Conversation With series, it's all about talking to people, brands, businesses across the spectrum of food and drink to find out more about why they do what they do and how in their way they're championing change and shifting the future of food and drink, and in this case, very much drink. So welcome, Polly and Matt. We're going to chat in detail about what you do and why, but can we just start with an introduction to Find and Foster?
So Find and Foster is a fine cider company where we produce world-class champagne method keeved pet nat and still ciders using fruit that was going to waste from very beautiful old traditional orchards around Devon, which we foster. So we cultivate them, nurture them and encourage them to thrive.
That sounds, I mean, I've had the benefit of coming to visit you, and it's a really, I think, a really inspiring concept, and to see it actually happening in the moment is a wonderful thing. I have to ask you: is cider making in your blood? Is it part of both of your backgrounds? How did you come to form Find and Foster?
For neither of us, it's not in our blood, is it?
No, we had, my parents had some apple trees and we used to make apple juice every year, and some friends of theirs used to make cider and we used to go and help them with that, but it was never a sort of thing that I thought I'd end up pursuing as a career.
No, and I didn't, when I started the business, I didn't really have any idea about cider, but actually I think that's been a good thing overall. But I started it, I was involved in agriculture and actually went on an EU-funded study tour to Tuscany that was about slow food and about how Tuscan farmers communicate the value of the produce that they grow. And I was studying sustainable agriculture. Yeah, so started researching orchards in Devon and realizing there are all these incredible, beautiful orchards where the fruit was just going to waste, and they no longer really served a purpose on many farms. And so I started talking to farmers and asking if they would be interested in having us help look after their orchards and just take fruit that was going to waste in return.
And did you, I mean, prior to that, was it something that, how did it kind of capture your attention? I'm assuming, were you doing something before you set up Find and Foster, and what was that, I guess, epiphany, I guess, that moment?
The epiphany really was on this study tour. I just happened to meet somebody who mentioned that they were looking after an old orchard in Herefordshire that was really run down and neglected and needed looking after, and he mentioned that there were quite a few of them around Herefordshire, and I just thought they may well be the same around Devon, and I just started researching orchards in Devon, and got to realizing that there were a load of orchards in Devon that well, we'd lost 90% of the orchards in Devon since the Second World War, and those that were remaining were in pretty poor condition, a lot of them.
And what was the reason for, let's talk a little bit more about neglected orchards. What do you mean by neglected orchards, and why are there so many, I suppose?
Basically, the orchards we work with are all sort of traditional standard orchards, so big trees, and they tend to be planted on sort of fairly difficult parts of the farm, so on slopes and with poor access. So as cider making became a much more sort of commercial prospect, no one was really willing. Well, it wasn't really worth anyone's time to go and pick this fruit because the labor costs to go and gather it wasn't worth it when you could just buy fruit from a orchard which had been harvested by machine. They just had become sort of commercially unviable. But a lot of that's to do with the value that people weren't really treating the fruit with the respect that it deserves. Because if you compare it to lots of vineyards, it's no more difficult to harvest than many vineyards are. And yet, because people don't sort of value the fruit at the same level, no one was bothering to do it. But that's sort of a problem that's come about with the way the UK has sort of, well, the way cider production has gone in the UK. It's sort of gone away from the quality of the fruit and really focusing in on that, and gone more towards sort of trying to produce something that's really consistent every year and you can drink all year round and make all year round.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So this is much more akin to, you've already made a couple of analogies, much more akin to winemaking and pursuing that and some of those principles as it is what we would perhaps think of as cider when we think of the mainstream brands that are on shelves and so on. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of cider is 30% concentrate, corn syrup, water, chemicals, and you could make that most of the year round, but with how it really could and should really be made is you harvest it during harvest and you press it and you get the group. You've got that one opportunity to make cider per year. It's not like beer where you can just make it over and over again all through the year. Yeah.
And actually, if you were to think of a particular wine style, say a particular a vineyard or wine house or whatever, you'd expect the wine to be nuanced and be different every year, wouldn't you? Because of the different climatic conditions and many different factors that would come into it. You wouldn't expect it to taste the same year after year, which is, I guess, really what you're saying.
Exactly.
Now, how does it work for farmers then? What do you do and what do they get, and how does this help, I guess, solve a bit of a problem for farmers?
It really depends on a case by, like, a farm by farm basis. So with some, we plant new trees to replace dead trees, which is really important with orchards, because if there's no incentive to do that, then all of these areas that were orchards would just no longer be orchard anymore. We winter prune the trees, which a lot of the time kind of helps stop them fall over and encourages new growth. Which is really important where it's an old variety that maybe perhaps that's the only one of that variety. And after you've winter pruned, it's quite important to summer prune, because winter pruning can create loads of crazy growth that just is bad for the tree. So and we manage the sward we've grown a flock of Shropshire sheep to manage the sward underneath the trees, which really helps to stop the orchards from getting really overgrown with brambles and nettles, and prevents the need for spraying or mowing.
Lots of the work, especially when we first taken on orchards, lots of the trees will have sort of brambles growing up through the canopy and are almost like inaccessible because of the amount of overgrown sort of scrub around them. And that's taken us quite a few years to sort of work to get back to some of those trees. And then the trees themselves take another couple of years to sort of recover from the fact that they were totally swamped. So yeah, I guess it's just sort of a regeneration of an environment that was just being left to become overgrown and unproductive, I suppose.
I'm assuming as well that it also helps, particularly if you're introducing animals to the environment as well, that it helps to drive biodiversity and insects, and there's a whole kind of pollination piece there. It's like a little ecosystem, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. It really does. There's so many benefits for bringing sheep into an orchard. They really help to kind of manage this ward in a way that creates lots of different little environments that suits lots of different small mammals, and it gets rid of the kind of nutrients in a way that helps. It benefits the grass underneath the trees in a lot of ways.
And I'm assuming that the sheep don't damage the trees in any way. It's quite a harmonious environment for both to coexist.
So we have Shropshire sheep, which have become known as a kind of environmentally friendly tree grazers.
They've been bred to be good to use to graze like plantations and things.
Yeah, exactly.
Use them in like Christmas tree plantations and stuff.
Yeah.
And they shouldn't strip the bark of the trees.
Yeah.
So they will, if there's like low hanging branches and there's leaves they can get at, they'll eat those, and they'll eat the fruit if they can get it. But they won't sort of eat the bark, which is the main. Like if a tree loses a few leaves off the lower canopy, it's not really a problem. But if they start chewing the bark off the trunk, then that will eventually kill the tree. So it's quite but you've got to keep your eye on them and make sure you get rid of any troublemakers.
Yeah, exactly. Any that start influencing the rest of the flock.
Yeah.
I mean, thinking about, you're sort of, I guess, painting a bit of a picture, really. But how are the orchards that you work with fundamentally different from a commercial orchard, as an example?
So lots of ways. Firstly, the range of different apple varieties. So there's an incredible number of really unusual old varieties. A lot of, maybe they're the last one of its kind, or maybe they're dying out or rare. And these trees have proven that they're there without having been sprayed for tens or hundreds of years. And they're a really important kind of gene bank they're an example of something that doesn't need a fungicide or a chemical to survive. So a lot of the supermarket apple varieties they've been bred in a way that they rely on being sprayed to exist. But these are a really good kind of resource.
They're also planted in a very different way. So the trees are typically sort of 10 meters apart, probably, and are quite big trees. Whereas like modern orchards are on smaller rootstocks, so the trees are planted a lot closer together.
And because there's no spraying, the orchards is just full of biodiversity. So there's a lot of butterflies and bees and birds in these orchards. They're really amazing places. And
loads of amazing like lichens and fungus and all kinds of stuff,
which I guess all feed into the character and the flavour of the finished fruit, I'm guessing, as well.
Yeah, and also that we manage them in a way where we'll keep some standing dead wood and keep log piles and all those things that are really friendly and needed by a lot of small mammals and insects and birds.
Thinking as we talked a little bit about the orchards themselves, and we'll talk about different kind of apple varieties and blending and so on in a minute, but can you talk to us about the basics of cider making and some of the different varieties that you of cider that you produce? Because I know, compared to, if anybody's watching or listening and thinking of the cider aisle in their supermarket, what we're talking about here is quite different. So could you kind of bring that to life for us a bit?
Like Polly said a minute ago, the orchards we use have lots of different varieties in them, and lots of them are the sort of only orchard on the farm that was left after lots of other orchards were dug up, and they tend to be the one nearest the sort of farmhouses. So they were planted with a mixture of fruit. So there'd be some cider fruit and then some cooking fruit and some dessert fruit. So we've got sort of quite small quantities of each variety we work with, but they're very, very diverse. So when Polly first started, she wanted to try and produce ciders that sort of showcased the fruit that we had available. So the cooking and dessert fruit it produces quite a sort of acid-driven cider, because like if you imagine when you bite into a dessert apple or you eat a bit of a cooking apple, the reason it tastes more palatable than perhaps a cider apple would, or one of the reasons, is that the sugar level is really well balanced with the acid.
Yeah.
When it's fermented, you obviously take away all the sugar and you're left with just the acid. So, well, and other flavors, but if you make cider with that sort of fruit, it ends up with quite a high acid level, but a really nice sort of fresh, like vibrant flavor. And Polly sort of noticed that would lend itself well to possibly having a second fermentation in the bottle, like sparkling wines. So that's why we started to produce that style of cider.
So making that, you use exactly the same method as you would to use to make champagne. So you do a primary fermentation and then you bottle with champagne yeast, and we age it on a champagne yeast lees for about 2 years or more.
Okay.
And then hand riddle and hand disgorge, and then you've got something it's champagne but made with apples instead, and it's made to drink in the same way as an aperitif or pairs well with seafood and that kind of thing.
And this for you is this is what you would call what, traditional method, or what? Yeah.
So it's not so legally you can't call it the champagne method, and actually it was used to make cider before it was ever made champagne anyway.
Okay, good to know.
You can't use the word champagne, but that's what people recognize. So the term really is the traditional method, but in Devon, I think people's idea generally of the traditional method of making champagne of cider is scrumpy. So we try to steer away from traditional method and use the French term on the bottles. Method, which they're now, but it's a champagne method.
And so this one is, as you say, would you describe it as being a little more refined, perhaps?
Very refined and kind of elegant. So we also make a keeved cider, which has a lot of residual apple sugars.
Right. Tell me about keeved. I love keeved cider. I do. So tell everyone about keeved.
So it's an old French English method where you just try to you slow the fermentation in a way that's going to keep the apple's sugars in it, and then you bottle it while the fermentation is still going, and it continues to ferment forever, really, but really, really slowly. And you make something that's just really appley and really juicy and stays sweet forever.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons I quite like it is it does have a certain sweetness, but it's really, really appley. I mean, obviously all cider is appley, but it's the appliness that I really like about keeved cider.
Yeah, it has quite a different, because lots of sweet ciders are sweetened at the end, either with sugar or with apple juice. But when you retain the original sort of sugars from the fruit, you definitely have it gives a much nicer sweetness than if it was back sweetened, I think.
So we've got the traditional method and we've got keeved, and then what are the other styles that you produce?
So we make a pet nat, which is it's quicker to produce than the other two, and it's if anybody knows pet nat in wine, it's exactly the same thing as that. So it's more kind of rustic, but it's just our aim is to make something that's medium dry but very fruity, and you just bottle during the primary fermentation. So before the first fermentation is finished, and you just capture a natural sparkle in the bottle. So it's a little bit cloudy, and with our pet nats, we do a kind of skin contact thing where we punch milled apple into the fermentation to try and extract a lot of the fruity aromas.
Oh wow!
they're a really kind of fruity version of a pet nat, very similar to a natural wine.
Yeah, and I guess is if I'm right, this is also the one where you have to be a little bit careful about when you bottle it. Is this so that if too much of that fermentation carries on in the bottle, you don't get bottles that go bang. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that, and you've got to be careful you don't have too much sediment, because even if you haven't bottled it too early, you could still getting a lot of gushing if there's too much sediment in there.
So that's traditional method, keeved, pet nat, and then do you do a still cider as well?
Yeah,
we've started doing still ciders more recently, partly because of starting to use orchards that had more sort of traditional cider fruit in them, so quite tannic apples, which it took us a few years to sort of work out where best to use them, but then we decided that rather than sort of trying to squeeze them into something we were already making, we try and produce something that sort of made the best of the tannin and the sort of mouth feel you can achieve. So we've made 2 still ciders, one that was intended to be a sort of substitute for a red wine, and then one that would be a substitute for a white wine. So the white wine style one is much more sort of acid driven. And then the red wine one is more of a sort of tannic side of thing.
and we've just started putting some cider in cans as well.
And is that the still cider that you're putting into cans? No,
so it's the same kind of blend of fruit and the same kind of medium dry as our pet nat. So it's had the skin contact kind of thing, and it was the one that we felt would work well in a can. So obviously you could never make something that was like champagne that just went in a can. So it's going to have 2 years in a bottle, and you couldn't. And I don't think that it would be. I don't think a can would do justice to the keeved either. But our pet nat was the kind of thing that we felt would work. Obviously, the true pet nat, because you haven't done no fermentation, but it's the same kind of the same kind of thing.
And is that you mentioned canning there? Is that to drive it into a different occasion, or what was the reason, the thinking behind, other than I guess convenience and having one in your rucksack? What was it? Yeah. What was the motivation for canning?
There's a combination of things really. So that partly was to just have a different format that was more, I guess, more approachable, because it's if it's a new product that you haven't come across before, buying a 750ml bottle of it is a bit of a jump perhaps, whereas if you can just buy a can in order to try it, we thought it was a good way of getting more people to enjoy cider how we think it should be made. But also it's partly a sort of like an eco decision, because the weight of the glass bottles that we use is quite high in order to hold the pressure. And they all come from France, so shipping all the bottles from France, the sort of carbon footprint involved with glass production is pretty massive. So we've been looking at ways of trying to reduce that, and canning is quite an obvious way of saving a lot. And
when we've tried to do reusing glass before, it's often not really worked. It would be ideal, but it's difficult. We tried it with the Tate Modern ones, and they returned the bottles having not really been washed out properly, and then it was just impossible to get them clean enough to use again. And recycling glass uses so much. I mean, yes, it's not great for the environment. So canning, the metal can be recycled forever, and it's not so energy
intensive.
So it's, it was definitely a big part of it was an environmental decision, but we can't do it with everything that we make.
No, and there's a real, I think it also has a different table presence as well. I mean, obviously you can use it it's a lot more kind of portable and convenient, but also there's think about application restaurants and dining and so on, it's become quite acceptable, much more acceptable now to have a feature can that's kind of poured at the table and that kind of thing. So as well as having it out of home, there's probably a hospitality application for it as well. It would look really interesting.
Yeah, I hope so. It's a very new thing to us, so we haven't really seen that yet, but hopefully we will.
Yeah, and also the fact that lots of places are a bit, if they're quite reluctant sometimes to put things on by the glass because they're not sure if they'll get through the bottle before it's going to not be as good as it should be. Whereas with a can, if it's a single serve or more or less a single serve, it makes it a much more sort of viable prospect as a thing to go on by the glass.
I just wanted to go back to a little bit that leads on from the conversation we had about different types of styles. All of the ciders that you produce are blended, but how do you go about the blending? Do you get that sense of how the blending will kind of come together even before they're pressed? But how does that work? Is it an art or a science?
It's both an art, and the whole of cider making is an art and a science, which is what keeps it so interesting. But yeah, blending is a process that starts kind of in our heads, and then it's in the orchard when you're choosing which tree to pick from. But that depends on which fruit's perfectly ripe at that time in the season, because we only pick perfectly ripe fruit, and so we have to keep visiting the different orchards over and over again. And so it's down to that, and then we'll have an idea of what we want to make. So we'll blend when we press. And then when it starts fermenting, we can blend between the different tanks. And then we've got some French oak barrels and stainless steel tanks, and you kind of blend between those things. And yeah, it's a constant process, blending.
And it feels like you're very led by the fruit as well, rather than being led by a brand or a perception of what a consumer might feel is a Find and Foster cider. It feels like you're very much being driven by the raw material and what that can offer, and then putting it into kind of loose types and styles.
Yeah, definitely. So we always try and have consistency year to year with the styles, like you said, but sort of are led by what each harvest brings. And so some of the apple trees only fruit every other year, so the fruit on offer does change a lot year to year, and that's quite an important part of the whole process. I think the changes from year to year, because the cider sort of almost tells the story of what that year's summer was like, and all sorts of those things are sort of captured in the bottle at the end.
The aim is always just making really kind of trying to showcase the fruit as well as we can, rather than make something specific.
And I have to tell you, how do you harvest? I mean, I've seen commercial orchards and seen them, how they shape the trees and all that kind of thing. Is that something that you do, or is it or do you use a different method? How do you go about it?
We almost all of the apples we harvest from the floor. Always all cider varieties we harvest from the floor. There's some dessert varieties that we'll pick from the tree, but there's not many dessert varieties.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix. Some of the fruit doesn't keep that well on the ground. So that stuff we'll pick from the ground, but also we'll try and we'll sometimes shake if we feel like that tree's pretty much ripe and we're going to miss it if we don't shake it. We'll shake a few off.
But harvest is always it always starts out really fun, and there's lots of people who come and volunteer. And
I was just going to ask you that. It sounds like it's quite labour intensive, and there's two of you. So how do you do it?
If you notice we're struggling to form sentences, it's because we're coming to the end of harvest, and it's a really tiring time.
But yeah, we get luckily we have lots of friends who are willing to come and help in exchange for some food and some cider, which is usually quite good fun.
And anyone is really welcome to come and help. It's always, we just put out on social media when we're we'll occasionally just say, would anyone like to come and help with harvest? And everyone's free to come and help. And it is always a really fun day because they're just really beautiful environments to spend time in.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that how lucky you are to sort of be able to spend time in these places, because some of them are just really sort of magical environments and really nice places to spend time. And I often sort of, because we go there all the time, you forget that they're quite special places to go. And then you'll take someone else there and it sort of is really nice because it reminds you sort of how lucky you are to be able to almost treat it like your own garden in a way.
Yeah, no, I can imagine what that is like. They're obviously often very tranquil places as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and the number of kind of birds and butterflies you see throughout the year is amazing.
Yeah. And I have to ask you, do you only make cider or do you make perry as well?
Well, because of the way we work with orchards and we only use fruit in orchards we look after, we only have access to 5 perry pear trees.
Oh, wow.
So we make a very tiny amount of perry, but it's really good. I love it. I love making perry. It's a really lovely product. Yeah, so it's a tiny amount.
So we've only released 1 perry so far, which was in 2020, I think. And we've got 1 in the tank at the moment, which hopefully we'll release in the new year, probably, or maybe.
Quite lucky when I came to see you because you were pressing perry pears, so I got to try to try a little bit of the perry pear juice, which was incredible.
Yeah,
it is amazing, isn't it? The perry pears have got such incredible levels of tannins and acids, and they're just a really interesting flavour and colour.
Yeah, it was delicious just in its own right, actually. This feels very much like a labour of love for you, almost perhaps an obsession. And I'd really just like to ask you why you do it.
It's a good question. Yeah, well, we were talking about this yesterday with friends who are helping pick apples in the orchards, because we look after more trees than we need to. And when we think about, well, maybe we should not really work with that orchard anymore because we don't need to, it would be so disappointing to stop looking after those spaces. And it is just really nice to be helping to safeguard these places and to get to spend time in them and to make something amazing. So it's definitely a passion project, but it's it's got to be, but in order for us to be able to do it, it has to be economically sustainable as much as it is environmentally sustainable. So it's both.
But it's very rewarding as well, isn't it? I think, and it's allowed us to do something together where we can both sort of offer an equal amount. Like neither of us are sort of, like, it would be very difficult to do it without both of us involved. And I think we wouldn't really be interested in it if it wasn't for the fact that we sort of get to do everything from we see the orchards all through the year. Because often you talk to other like cider makers or winemakers who don't really get to do any of the work in the orchard because the orchards they use are enormous and they buy the fruit in, or even if they don't buy the fruit in, there's no way they could be managing all the fruit and harvesting it and doing the work in the cidery. But because of the sort of scale of what we do, we're lucky that we can sort of see the process throughout the whole year, which is really nice.
I'm going to come back to that point in just a moment, actually, about scale. But if I can just ask you, which kind of leads on from, I guess, why do you do it? If you had to characterize, I mean, this whole series is a bit about exploring purpose. So if you had a purpose, what would the purpose of Find and Foster be? What is it that you're ultimately trying to do?
I think for me there's two main purposes, and one is just kind of looking after orchard environments that need to kind of be made into something that's going to generate an income for themselves. But the other is just to kind of show people how amazing cider can be. It doesn't need to be a really terrible thing. It doesn't need to be just really sickly sweet or taste like silage. I mean, it can be an amazing thing, and yeah, I just love to change people's attitudes towards cider.
Yeah, I think that's something that because I would have said originally it was partly a sort of lifestyle choice because it's something we both enjoy doing. But the more we've done it, the more I think that's become my sort of main sort of goal would be to change people's perception of cider. I mean, it's not going to be quick, but like if you think how excited people get about a vineyard,
Yes,
I think it's a shame that there's all this amazing fruit that grows and people are always trying to get rid of their apples because they're like, we've got so many apples.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't realize the quality of the product you can make from apples. And it would be nice if in sort of 20 years time, people were as excited about their local cider maker as they were about a vineyard just around the corner.
Yeah.
And as a product, I mean, relative to wine, it's so good for the environment. These trees are all, especially when you graze sheep with trees, they're all just sequestering tons and tons of carbon.
Yeah.
And it's just and they don't need any chemicals sprayed on them. And it's just something that they do. And we're all, just to make our businesses work, we're planting trees, and it's just such an environmentally friendly kind of business. So it would be great if people could just get on board with it and start kind of appreciating cider for what it can be.
Yeah, definitely. And for many people, I mean, we've spoken as part of this series to lots of people, and very often when you talk to people about success, it's about bigger and it's about growing. But what does success look like for you? Is it about growth and bigger, or actually is there something else?
For me personally, it's not about growth and bigger at all. Like, I just want to be making the best possible cider we can make, and I just really want to change people's perceptions and just get people to try it and love it and buy it, and for that to then really help to look after the orchard environments. Yeah, it's not at all for me about bigger.
No, I'd agree. As long as we're making and selling enough that it can sustain us, which isn't, you don't have to sell that much, hopefully. We'll find out. But yeah, I think the sort of pursuit of quality is much more important for us than the pursuit of scale. Yeah. And I don't think, I mean, it is possible to make large quantities of stuff very well, but I think especially the way we work would be difficult to scale up enormously, and then I think it would sort of lose what we love about it to some extent.
Yeah. And in pursuit of quality and I guess betterment as opposed to scale, I've noticed that you also align or connect with the hospitality scene and also chefs and their associated sommeliers that are also in pursuit of that betterment and equality. Why is it? What's the kind of hospitality connection, and why does that work for you?
I think, well, a few things. One, sommeliers really appreciate the story behind it, and they appreciate the product, and you've got to, I mean, it helps to really understand a drink and really understand wine to appreciate how good the cider is. But also, it's just, we make most of our cider to be enjoyed with food. So to put it in a setting where there's beautiful food and a sommelier who's going to be able to communicate why it pairs well, it's just the perfect setting. We don't make much cider that's just for kind of sipping on its own. It's more really about the pairing with food.
Yeah, and having that, selling it in places where there's someone who understands how it should be served and what food it's going to go well with and can communicate that to a customer. because most people, if they sit in a restaurant and they open a wine list, they're probably not going to order a glass of sparkling cider over a glass of like prosecco or something, partly just because they won't have ever considered doing that, or they won't know to look for it in the menu. Whereas if there's someone there and they can see someone's not really sure what to have, and they say, well, if this is what you've ordered, why don't you try this? That sort of is such an important way of getting more people to try products like ours. It's completely invaluable to us.
I noticed that you had an event with King's Head Farm. I don't know if it's coming up or whether it's already happened. I can't remember, but that looked really exciting.
Yeah, we've had some really lovely events lately with Coombs Head Farm and Lilac, and our distributor just told us it's on the menu at
The Fat
the
Duck.
Fat Duck, which is fantastic.
That is fantastic. Congratulations, well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's those opportunities to go around and talk to people who are enjoying, they already trust it's going to be great food, and then to be able to talk to them about why this cider pairs well with that food is really, it's a great opportunity, and it's really rewarding seeing people try it in that setting and just really love it. Yeah, it's lovely.
And also really nice to work with places like Coombs Head and Lilac and other places that have like the same values that you have, and really appreciate the sort of the product, but from the very beginning. So like how the thing's grown and then how it's then turned into food and why that's important. So doing things with people like that is they're really important relationships to build on, I think.
And I think those types of places as well are important in the evolution of the craft cider, natural cider movement, which really feels like it's having its time at the moment, and it's beginning to be talked about in the same sort of context as natural wines and champagnes. Could you draw any kind of analogies as to why you think it's happening?
Well, it just should, really. It just really should. They're such similar products, and if you're into natural wine, you appreciate that natural winemakers are trying to kind of look after the environment, and a lot of natural wine kind of it tastes a little bit cidery, and so you might as well be open to the idea of cider because it is so much better for the environment.
And do you think people then are just more curious about, being a little bit more experimental with taste, or do you think it's perhaps leans more into the environmental and sustainability agenda? Or
I think it must be a bit of both, really. I guess although cider is very different to beer, lots of like people's beer tastes, if you compare them to like 10 years ago, people are willing to try all sorts of stuff with beer. And I think that is quite a useful, that's opened a lot of people's eyes to things that they didn't realize they liked. And I think it's made people more adventurous outside of the beer market into other things, because if you realize you like bizarre beers that you didn't realize you liked before, you're more likely to think, oh, I wonder what this is. But equally, definitely people seem to be becoming a lot more, or placing a lot more value on where their food has come from and how it's been grown, and sort of wanting to know the story behind where the products come from. And one thing that's nice for us is that you don't sort of have to have a marketing team to invent a story, because this business
it is
an interesting story already.
What you do is the story, isn't it? I'm really fascinated, and I think you probably covered it, it's probably obvious, but the name Find and Foster, why?
So it really was just about finding these orchards that needed help looking after, and then fostering them. So we look after them, we foster them, we cultivate them and nurture them and encourage them to thrive. And it's not that we're somewhat one of us is foster and one of us is find.
No, that's a really yeah. I mean, it's really lovely. It's really yeah. You have a curiosity to find out and to foster. It works. It feels like it works on many different levels, as well as being the reality of what you've done and your story all in the name. It's really lovely. We find in all of our kind of trends and foresight work, we hear all of the time that people are drinking less. But how does what you're doing, how does Natural Craft Cider, how does your brand kind of exist in that space where people are drinking less, do you think?
I think it's, that works perfectly in our favor, because you need to just, if you're going to drink less but drink better quality drinks, that really suits us.
Also, cider's a very good, it's a much lower ABV than wine, for example. So if people are trying to sort of reduce how many units they're drinking, but still want to have something with their meal, lots of ciders are only half what a bottle of wine is.
That's true, actually.
Yeah, I think potentially that's quite a good movement for cider.
Yeah.
And the cider we make is all kind of as intense as wine. So we don't serve any of our ciders in a pint glass. We serve it all in smaller glasses.
Yeah.
So it suits the drinking less too.
Well, I've only ever enjoyed your cider with food. So I have to ask you, what's your favourite food to pair? And I'd love to know the food and the type of cider that you would put with it. If I can ask you both.
I really, really love our pet nats with kind of Mexican or Jamaican.
Yeah, okay.
But the obvious one is the champagne method with mussels or salty seafood.
Yeah.
We had a one of our pet nats that was called Snicket that we actually recently saw on a website. I thought it had all been sold out, but there is still some of it available. From, where was that? Elston and Son or something. And that was really good with fish and chips. Was like the perfect fish and chips accompaniment, because it was quite a fairly acidic pet nat, and the sort of fresh acidity was so good with fried fish and chips. Really amazing. Also, my other favorite is the keeved cider with kedgeree or any smoked fish dish.
Yeah, with smoked fish. Yeah, I can imagine that, actually, being a lover of your keeved cider and smoked fish. I can imagine that would work very, very well together, actually.
And we did an event with Rochelle Canteen in London recently where they paired our Root, which is our still very tannic cider, which is almost like a kind of bold red wine, with hog's pudding. So the kind of fattiness and the tannins really worked so well together. They definitely brought the best out of one another.
Yeah, no, that also sounds equally fabulous. Also, thinking that you can get pet nat in a can, or pet nat style in a can. Thinking about your analogy of fish and chips and people eating fish and chips out of home, that feels like an obvious thing to have a couple of those in your bag if you're eating fish and chips on the beach or something like that.
Yeah, that'd be a great pairing. We tried that.
Yeah, stocking it in fish and chip shops. That sounds like And lastly, I'd really just like to ask you, what, looking to the future, looking to next year and beyond, what's next for Find and Foster?
Well, every year we kind of find tiny ways of improving things, like maybe sourcing better corks or a new French oak barrel. And so it's just for me, it would just be keeping on trying to make things better in every way. And we're doing a lot of events at the Cider House, which is in Huxham in Devon. So getting more people to the cidery is a really important thing for us, so people can actually see it, taste everything, appreciate the orchard environments.
That's something that I think would be nice to do, as well as sort of fine-tuning the ciders, would be to keep the work going in the orchards, the regeneration, but also to allow more people to come and see the orchards, especially during like the blossom season and stuff, because they're so beautiful.
Yeah, no,
And a lot of, I mean, people don't get the opportunity to go to them because they're mostly on private land. So, but being able to sort of walk people through the orchards while there's blossom there and get them to taste the cider then that's something that I think we should try and
connecting people.
Yeah.
Connecting people with
we
the
do
environment.
offer monthly tour and tastings, and we just need to tell people about it because it's there and it's available and it's on our website, but it's just letting people know that they can come and enjoy these environments as much as we do.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And of course, if anybody wants to buy Find and Foster and sample it, how do they do that?
Well, we have a website which is findandfosterfineciders.com, which has an online shop and also tickets to events and tours and that kind of thing. But there's also shops, bottle shops and restaurants all over the UK that stock it. We're never that great at knowing exactly where, but locally it's always at Darts Farm and Pullo. But yeah, the Fine Cider Company is also a great online source of our cider and other great ciders.
Or go to the Fat Duck.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's probably the cheapest option.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much, both of you. That concludes this episode of the Food People in Conversation with Polly and Matt. On behalf of us all at the Food People and the In Conversation with audience, thank you for joining me today to tell and to explore the Find and Foster story and opening our eyes to the possibilities of world-class leading ciders, the different styles and so on as well. It's been absolutely fascinating and inspiring to talk to you both. Thank you very much.
No, thanks very much for
Thank
having
you.
us.
So do join our TFP community for the details of our latest In Conversation with episodes, as well as the latest free to access food and drink trends foresight. Visit thefoodpeople.co.uk and complete your details at the footer of the page. On behalf of Polly, Matt and myself, thanks for listening to the Food People in Conversation with. Join with us in the trends of today and the foresight of tomorrow to shift the future of food and drink. And I leave you with one question, as always, which is, how are you shifting the future of food and drink? Thanks for listening.